Sarah had only been on the Navy base for 3 weeks when her name appeared on the duty roster in a way that made her stomach tighten, not because she was afraid of hard work, but because she immediately understood the intention behind it. She had been assigned to gate duty, the one post everyone whispered about, the post no one wanted, and as soon as the list was read out, she noticed the sideways glances and the quiet chuckles from a few of the older sailors. Gate duty was not glamorous, not important in the eyes of most, but it was often used as punishment or as a way to remind the newest and youngest that they were at the bottom. Sarah knew she had done nothing wrong, but she could see the smirk on one petty officer's face, and she understood, this was not about fairness, it was about testing her, maybe even mocking her. Some people had doubted her since the first day she walked onto the base, standing tall in her uniform but carrying the weight of being new, young, and in their eyes unproven. That night, when she returned to her small room and polished her boots until they shined, when she pressed her uniform carefully and tied her hair neatly under her cap, she remembered what her father had told her before she shipped out: respect the post, no matter how small it seems, because how you handle the small things will show who you are in the big things. His words echoed in her head as she prepared herself, not only for the long hours ahead but also for the unspoken challenge behind them. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the gate before her shift officially began. She wanted to be ready, not rushed, not flustered, because she knew people would be watching. The gate stood like a silent boundary between the base and the world beyond, and it was her job to guard it, to greet every vehicle, to salute every officer, and to check every ID with care. At first, the task felt simple, almost mechanical: raise your hand, speak the words, glance at the card, hand it back, wave them through. But the longer she stood there, the more she became aware of the weight of the position. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and already her shoulders were warming under the heat, but she did not shift her stance. She stood straight, as she had been taught, her voice steady with each greeting. Some drivers barely looked at her, sliding their cards through the window with distracted expressions, but others studied her for a moment, perhaps surprised to see someone like her on duty, perhaps searching for signs of inexperience. She could almost feel the eyes of her peers from a distance, the ones who had placed her here, waiting for her to falter. Hours moved slowly, each car blending into the next, and though Sarah's body began to ache, she forced herself to focus on the small details. She thought about her salute, making it sharp each time. She thought about her tone, keeping it respectful but firm. She thought about the way her cap sat squarely on her head, refusing to let the wind or sweat shift it out of place. Every tiny action was a choice, a way to show that she would not take this assignment as an insult, but as an opportunity. Still, she could not stop the thoughts that pressed into her mind when a few cars slowed just long enough for the sailors inside to exchange knowing glances or whisper to each other, as though she could not hear. She did not hear the words, but she heard the laughter, soft and cutting. For a brief second, doubt crept in, asking why she had been singled out, asking if perhaps she really did not belong here, but she pushed it away quickly, lifting her hand again for the next salute. As the day stretched on, the monotony became a rhythm, steady and unchanging. It would have been easy to let her focus slip, to grow careless in the heat, but Sarah reminded herself again and again that respect was earned, not given. Her mother's face came to her mind, the way she had cried quietly in the kitchen the night before Sarah left for training, thinking her daughter could not hear. Sarah had promised herself she would make her mother proud, and even standing at a lonely gate, she felt the weight of that promise. She thought about the people who had believed in her, her teachers, her friends back home, her father who had pushed her to keep going when training had been hardest. She thought about the pride she felt the first time she put on her uniform and the determination that had carried her through weeks of exhaustion. That same determination now steadied her as she wiped the sweat from her brow, as she stood straighter when her body wanted to sag, as she told herself over and over that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her crack. By the late afternoon, Sarah felt her legs heavy under her, her back stiff, but her mind sharper than ever. She realized something important as she watched the endless line of vehicles roll forward. This post, which had been meant as a joke, was shaping her more than any easy assignment ever could. It was teaching her patience, discipline, and humility. It was showing her that strength did not always come in the moments when the crowd was cheering, but in the long, quiet hours when no one seemed to care. And though she did not know it, though she could not have guessed it, someone important would soon pass through that gate. Someone whose presence would silence the laughter of those who had mocked her, someone whose simple action would show everyone else what she had already begun to prove to herself, that respect was not about where you were placed, but about how you stood where you were. Sarah lifted her hand again, sharp and steady, unaware that her long day at the gate was about to change everything. The long hours at the gate had begun to blend together when Sarah noticed a dark vehicle approaching slowly, not the ordinary kind she had been seeing all day, but one that carried a quiet weight, the kind of presence that made even the guards straighten their backs without being told, and though she had no idea who might be inside, she did exactly what she had been doing since morning, standing tall, lifting her hand in a sharp salute, and greeting with steady words. And as the window rolled down, she suddenly found herself looking at a man whose face was known by almost everyone on the base, a man whose reputation carried more respect than rank alone, because he was not only an officer but a Navy SEAL commander, the kind of leader whose name was spoken with both admiration and caution, and Sarah's heart skipped for just a second, though her voice did not falter as she asked politely for his identification card, which he handed to her with a calm expression, his eyes studying her. Not in a harsh or dismissive way, but in the way of someone who noticed details, someone who read people quickly, and in that brief moment Sarah felt seen, not just as another sailor at the gate but as a person who was standing her post with pride. She checked the card carefully, handed it back with respect, and said, "Thank you, sir, have a good day," her words simple but firm, and he nodded once before driving through, leaving Sarah with the pounding of her heart in her chest and the quiet thought that she had just been tested in a way she had not expected. What Sarah did not know was that the commander had noticed more than her crisp salute or her professional tone. He had noticed the way she stood without shifting despite the heat, the way her uniform was worn with care, and the way her eyes did not carry resentment or weariness but determination, and though he did not say anything in that moment, something had quietly changed, because his word on the base carried weight, and when he respected someone, others quickly followed. As the commander's vehicle disappeared, Sarah returned to her rhythm, not knowing that a few pairs of eyes had widened when they saw what had happened, because those who had put her on gate duty as a joke had not expected the scene, had not imagined that the very leader they looked up to would stop and look at her with recognition, and their laughter, once so easy, now caught in their throats. Hours later, when Sarah finally finished her duty and returned to the barracks, she was exhausted but strangely content, because though the day had been long, she felt she had carried herself well, and she went to bed with the simple thought that she had honored her post. The next morning, however, whispers had already begun to spread across the base, whispers about how the SEAL commander had stopped at the gate and spoken with the new sailor, how he had nodded at her with the kind of approval that was rare, and though Sarah did not hear all of it, she noticed the shift in how a few people looked at her, no longer with smirks but with something closer to curiosity. She carried on with her duties as usual, never letting pride take over, because she believed respect had to be earned daily, not assumed overnight, but inside she felt a quiet strength growing, as if the long day at the gate had planted something in her that could not be taken away. That week, Sarah found herself assigned to other small tasks, and though they were still far from glamorous, she handled them with the same seriousness, remembering again her father's words about respecting even the smallest post, and one afternoon, when she was cleaning equipment in the supply area, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see the same commander walking past. He stopped briefly, glanced at her, and said in a calm voice, "You did well at the gate the other day," before continuing on, and those simple words sank into Sarah's heart like an anchor of encouragement, because in a place where approval was rare and criticism was often sharp, the recognition of someone like him carried weight that could not be measured. She did not smile widely or brag to anyone, but she held on to the words quietly, letting them push her to keep going with the same determination. Around her, some of the same sailors who had once laughed now seemed unsure of how to treat her, and though no one apologized directly, Sarah noticed that the jokes at her expense faded away, replaced instead with silence or awkward glances, as if they were unsure whether the game had backfired. For Sarah, it was never about proving them wrong, it was always about proving to herself that she was strong enough to endure, strong enough to keep her head high even when people tried to push her down. The commander's recognition was more than she could have asked for, but what mattered most to her was that she had faced the test of loneliness and monotony and had not broken. At night, lying on her bunk, she thought about her family again, about her mother and father, and how proud they would be if they knew that their daughter had stood in the sun for hours without complaint, that she had carried herself with honor even when no one expected her to. She realized then that every post, no matter how small, had meaning, because it revealed character, and character was what truly built respect. What she could not see, though, was that this was only the beginning, because the commander who had noticed her once would notice her again, and the quiet respect she had earned would soon grow louder in ways she never imagined, turning what was meant as a joke into the first chapter of a story no one on that base would forget. The days that followed brought a quiet change to Sarah's life on the base, not in a loud or dramatic way but in the subtle shifts that only someone paying close attention could notice, and though she tried to move through her duties with the same steady pace, she could feel that people were beginning to look at her differently, as if they had begun to realize that the new girl they had thought would stumble had instead stood firm, and even though no one admitted it out loud, the respect of the SEAL commander had cast a light on her that no one could ignore. Sarah herself did not walk differently or speak differently, she did not carry herself with arrogance, because in her heart she knew that one kind word or one approving glance was not the same as true success, but she did feel stronger inside, like a foundation had been poured under her feet, and with that strength she approached every task no matter how small with even more focus than before. When she was sent to help in the mess hall, she carried trays with care. When she was asked to organize files, she kept them in perfect order. When her turn came again for gate duty, she stood tall without complaint, and slowly the laughter that had once followed her seemed to fade into the background, replaced by silence or cautious nods, as if those around her were unsure of how to treat someone who had quietly proven herself. One afternoon, while she was sweeping the deck near the supply building, Sarah overheard a small group of sailors talking in hushed voices, their words drifting through the air, and though she was not meant to hear, she caught enough to know they were speaking about her, saying how surprising it had been that the commander had not only noticed her but had spoken to her later, and one voice, softer than the rest, admitted that maybe they had been too quick to judge her. Sarah kept her eyes down, pretending she had not heard, but inside she felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude that someone was beginning to see her for who she was, sadness that it had taken another person's recognition for them to change their view, and determination that she would not waste the chance she had been given. That night, as she lay in her bunk, she thought about how life often worked that way, how sometimes people only saw worth when someone important pointed it out, and though it hurt to realize that, she promised herself she would keep earning respect the hard way, by showing up, by standing strong, and by letting her actions speak louder than any defense she could give. Not long after, Sarah was assigned to a small team preparing equipment for a training exercise, and though the task seemed ordinary, she treated it with the same seriousness she had treated the gate, checking every piece, making sure nothing was missing, working late even when others grew tired. When the commander walked through to inspect the preparations, his eyes fell on Sarah briefly, and once again she felt the weight of his attention, not in a way that made her nervous now, but in a way that gave her a quiet pride, because she knew he was seeing her work ethic, the way she did not cut corners, the way she stayed until everything was done. He said nothing as he moved on, but Sarah caught the faintest nod, and that was enough to keep her going. After the inspection, one of the sailors who had once mocked her came up and asked if she needed help finishing the last of the gear, and though his tone was awkward, Sarah accepted, because she believed that sometimes respect grew not through confrontation but through patience. The weeks continued, and slowly Sarah built a reputation for herself, not because of one grand act, but because of the small, steady choices she made every day. She became known as someone who could be trusted to do her job without complaint, someone who treated every assignment with seriousness, someone who did not seek attention but still earned it. And though she did not let herself forget how hard those first weeks had been, she also did not let bitterness take root, because she knew carrying anger would only weigh her down. Instead, she carried gratitude for the lesson of the gate, for the words of her father that had stayed with her, and for the moment when the commander's respect had lit a path forward she had not expected. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was painted in soft orange light, Sarah found herself walking back from the training grounds when she passed by a group of new recruits, fresh from training, their faces young and uncertain. One of the girls glanced at her nervously, clearly feeling the same weight Sarah had once carried, and Sarah gave her a small nod and a smile, remembering how lonely those first days had felt. It was then she realized something important. Her story was no longer just about proving herself, it was about showing others that they could endure too, that even the smallest post could be honored, that respect could be earned in the quiet ways. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought again about her parents, about the way her father had spoken with such conviction, and she whispered a promise into the dark, that she would keep carrying herself with the same strength, that she would not let the laughter of others or even the recognition of leaders define her, but only her own determination to stand tall no matter where she was placed. She did not yet know that bigger challenges were coming, challenges that would test her far more than gate duty ever had, but she felt ready in her heart, because she had learned that strength was not about being noticed, but about being steady when no one expected it. As weeks turned into months, Sarah continued to move through her days with the same quiet determination, never asking for special attention, never seeking shortcuts, simply doing her work with care and showing respect to every task she was given, and though the memory of those early laughs still lingered in the corners of her mind, they no longer stung the way they once had, because she had grown stronger and had found a steady rhythm in the life of the base, but it was during a large training exercise that her strength and patience were tested in a way she had not faced before. The exercise involved multiple teams working together under pressure, moving equipment, checking communication lines, and coordinating with one another as if the scenario were real, and Sarah was placed on a team that was responsible for managing supplies and ensuring that everything was ready on time, a task that sounded simple but required sharp focus, because one mistake could slow down the entire operation. From the very beginning, Sarah gave all of her attention to the work, double-checking lists, carefully marking off items, and making sure that no small detail was missed, while around her some of the others moved quickly, cutting corners to finish faster, joking among themselves as if it did not matter. Sarah said nothing, but she kept her eyes on her work, steady and calm, and though a few rolled their eyes at her carefulness, she knew that this was who she was, someone who believed that small things built the larger picture. As the exercise grew more intense, the pace quickened, voices shouted orders, and the pressure increased, and in the middle of the rush one important piece of equipment was suddenly missing, creating a wave of confusion and frustration. Some of the sailors on her team immediately looked around in panic, blaming one another, but Sarah did not panic. She retraced the steps in her mind, walked calmly back through the supplies, and within minutes she found the missing gear tucked behind a stack of crates, overlooked by those who had hurried through. She carried it back without fanfare, placed it where it belonged, and quietly said, "Here it is," and while others breathed sighs of relief, she simply returned to her task. What Sarah did not realize was that the commander had been observing, watching the way different sailors responded to stress, and he had seen how Sarah's calm focus had prevented a larger problem, how her steady presence had quietly held the team together when panic had nearly broken it. Later that day, after the exercise ended, the commander spoke briefly with the senior officer in charge of the teams, and though Sarah did not hear their words, she noticed the way the officer's eyes flicked toward her with something like recognition. In the evenings, when Sarah finally returned to her bunk, she often thought about the days behind her, about how far she had come from that first humiliating moment at the gate, and though she did not yet fully understand it, she was beginning to see how the difficult posts, the long hours, and the unkind glances had all prepared her for these moments when quiet strength mattered more than loud words. A few of the sailors who had once mocked her now greeted her with nods or short words of respect, and though the apologies never came directly, she felt the change in the air, and she knew that time and patience were often the best answers to doubt. She also began to notice that some of the newer recruits looked at her differently, not with skepticism but with quiet hope, as if they were watching to see how she handled herself so they could learn how to handle their own struggles. That thought humbled her, reminding her that her actions reached further than she realized. It was during one of these late evenings that Sarah found herself called into the office of her superior officer, her heart tightening for a moment as she wondered if she had made a mistake, but when she entered, she was surprised to see the SEAL commander there as well, standing tall and calm. The officer spoke first, explaining that they had been watching her progress, that they had noticed her work ethic and the way she carried herself even under pressure, and then the commander added a few words of his own, saying simply, "You remind me of why small posts matter." Sarah listened quietly, her hands folded behind her back, and though her heart was pounding, she only nodded respectfully, replying with a steady voice that she was only doing her duty. The commander's eyes softened for a moment, and he said, "Sometimes duty done well is the strongest voice of all." Those words stayed with her long after the meeting ended, replaying in her mind as a reminder that respect was built through actions, not through speeches. From that day, Sarah noticed her duties began to change slightly, not in dramatic ways but in small shifts that gave her more responsibility, more trust. She was asked to help guide new recruits during their first weeks, to explain routines, to walk them through the kind of posts she herself had once been given. She remembered clearly how lonely and difficult those days had felt, and so she spoke to the recruits with kindness, reminding them that no post was meaningless, that every duty carried weight, and that even when others mocked or doubted, the way they carried themselves would matter most. Some listened closely, others only nodded politely, But Sarah knew that even if only one of them remembered her words in a moment of doubt, it would be enough. The air around her had changed. The girl who had once been placed at the gate as a joke was now someone others pointed to as an example, and though Sarah still felt she had much to learn, she carried herself with the same humility, never forgetting where she had started. At night, she still thought about her family, about the promise she had made to honor them with her service, and she felt that little by little she was living up to it. She did not yet know that an even greater challenge was waiting ahead, one that would not only test her patience or her focus but her courage in the face of uncertainty, and it would be in that moment that everything she had learned from the long lonely hours at the gate to the quiet nods of recognition would come together to show her true strength, and perhaps show others as well that the girl they had once underestimated had become someone they could trust when it mattered most. The turning point for Sarah came on a day that seemed ordinary at first, a bright morning where the base moved with its usual rhythm, the sound of boots against pavement, the calls of orders, the hum of vehicles in the distance, and Sarah began her duty as she always did, focused and steady. But that day a high-level inspection was scheduled, and though she had heard whispers of it, she did not think much of it, because she was used to doing her work without expecting anyone important to notice. Yet fate had different plans, for when the time came, she was once again assigned to the gate, the very same place where her journey of doubt and quiet strength had begun, and though she smiled faintly at the memory, she reminded herself that no post was too small, that every duty deserved her best. The sun was warm, the air carried a quiet stillness, and Sarah stood tall in her uniform, checking each ID with care, greeting each person with polite words, her eyes sharp but her tone calm, showing the balance of discipline and respect she had built over time. As the vehicles passed through, she noticed movement in the distance, a convoy approaching with officers of higher rank, and soon the car carrying the SEAL commander arrived, its presence unmistakable. Sarah's heart beat faster, but she held her composure, stepping forward with the same firm posture she had practiced countless times, her hand steady as she raised it in salute. The gate was filled with quiet eyes watching, sailors standing nearby, some of whom had once mocked her, waiting to see how this moment would unfold, and when the commander stepped out of the vehicle, tall and calm, his presence commanding respect without a word, he walked directly towards Sarah. Time seemed to pause, the noise of the bass fading for a brief second, as everyone waited. Sarah stood firm, her eyes steady, her voice respectful as she greeted him, but what happened next left the air heavy with silence, for the commander, instead of passing by without notice, stopped in front of her, looked her in the eye, and gave a slight but clear nod before returning her salute, a gesture so simple yet so powerful that those who had once laughed now froze, their eyes widening, because they realized the weight of that moment. This was not just a nod, it was recognition, a quiet declaration that the one they had once placed at the gate as a joke had earned the respect of the man whose respect mattered most. Sarah felt her chest tighten, not with pride that screamed for attention but with a quiet warmth, because she knew this was not the result of one day, not a lucky chance, but the reflection of every long night, every quiet hour where she had chosen to keep going despite the doubts, and though she kept her face calm, inside she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. Around her, the silence lingered before the base returned to motion, orders being shouted again, vehicles moving, but something had changed in that instant, for the eyes that once looked at her with dismissal now carried respect, and though no one said it aloud, she could feel it in the way they moved around her, in the way some stood straighter as if reminded that duty, no matter how small, carried weight. That evening, as Sarah walked back from her post, the sky painted in soft orange light, she allowed herself a deep breath, letting the moment settle into her memory, and she thought about her family far away, about how proud they would be if they had seen what had happened, and she whispered softly to herself that the promise she had carried since the beginning was no longer just a promise, it was becoming her truth. Days after the inspection, Sarah noticed even more subtle changes. Officers gave her assignments with trust, younger recruits approached her with questions, and the laughter that once echoed behind her was replaced by quiet greetings and words of respect, not loud or dramatic, but enough for her to feel that she had moved from being an outsider to someone others could look up to. Still, Sarah never let the recognition change her heart. She remained humble, never boasting, never speaking of the commander's salute, for she believed that true respect was not something to hold like a trophy but something to live each day through actions. She continued to work with care, guiding the new recruits with patience, reminding them that the posts that seemed small were often the most important, that character was not proven in moments of attention but in the hours when no one was watching, and slowly, her words became lessons that carried weight because they were not spoken as theory but as truth she had lived. One evening, as she sat quietly near the edge of the base, watching the waves in the distance, a young sailor approached her hesitantly and asked how she had kept going when others had doubted her, and Sarah smiled gently, answering in her simple way that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones no one could see, but if you stayed true to yourself, one day the world would see too. That moment stayed with her because she realized that her journey was no longer just about proving herself, it was about giving others the courage to believe in themselves as well. Months later, when Sarah looked back, she thought about how everything had started with a cruel joke, with being placed on gate duty so that others could laugh, and yet it was that very post, the one meant to break her spirit, that became the stage where she built her strength, where she learned patience, where she earned respect, and where the commander's salute changed not just how others saw her but how she saw herself. She had walked through days of loneliness, carried the weight of doubt, and faced silence when she longed for encouragement, but through it all, she had held to the belief that doing her duty mattered, and that belief had carried her further than she could have imagined. Her journey was not finished, and she knew challenges would still come, but now she carried with her the memory of that salute, a memory that reminded her that dignity and respect were not given freely but earned through quiet strength, through persistence, and through choosing to stand tall when others expected you to fall. And so Sarah continued forward, no longer the girl at the gate mocked by laughter, but the sailor whose steady heart had turned a joke into a lesson for everyone around her, and though she never sought the spotlight, her story became a quiet echo across the base, a reminder whispered among sailors that sometimes the one overlooked is the one who shines the brightest when it matters most.